Pacer Plus is our NAFTA. It basically opens up all the Pacific markets to Australia and New Zealand. And it doesn't give us too much in return. These kinds of things, Bitcoin cannot fix that. A lot of what will come of Bitcoin may be able to fix that. When Pacific nations become little Dubais, then, even though we're still categorised by the UN as SIDS, Small Island Developing States, they have a section for us every September at the UN General Assembly in New York. All the SIDS have their own little functions. Hopefully we'll gradually make it back into the main forum where we discuss things with everyone else and not just set off to the children's table.
Welcome to Bitcoin Basics with your hosts Faris and Gordon. Visit bitcoinbasics.help if you need help buying and securing your Bitcoin.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Bitcoin Basics podcast. It's Faris and Gordon here. We are recording on the 6th of June, 2022. The price of Bitcoin is $31,220. The block height is 739,506, and Satoshis per dollar is 3,203. Now, Gordon, we just finished a really wonderful and just mind-blowing interview with Lord Fusitu'a of Tonga. I don't know if I'm going to sleep tonight. There's so many things that are going to go through my head with this one. And unfortunately, due to our time commitments, we had to cut it short. But man, that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it sure was. And we're probably butchering his name too. So apologies for advancing that. He just has an amazing life story, just personally himself, Tonga as well. But, you'll hear in the interview, this was a long one, but an amazing one. And we could have gone on for hours and hours and hours. But as we said in the interview, this is where the rubber hits the road. This is where Bitcoin helps individuals and helps sovereign nations like Tonga developing, merging. I'm not sure what the political correct term is nowadays, but this is where it's at. So, we talk a lot on our show about Bitcoin basics, how to move your Bitcoin from an exchange to a hardware wallet. And all that stuff is important, don't get me wrong, but this is where it really affects lives. This is where it can actually make social change. So super exciting to hear about what they've planned already, see what they've planned, and we'll have him back on another 6 months. So
and just another personal note. So Lord Fusitu'a is running he's doing these interviews from a hospital bed. He had 3, not near-death experience, actual experiences.
Clinical deaths, yeah.
Yeah, 3 times clinically dead. He's lost a femur in his right leg. And in the middle of it, he could barely move. He said he could only lift one hand. And what did he do? He went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, and he's bringing Bitcoin to a sovereign state to help his people increase their GDP by 30%, at least right away. So this is a man who, could be looking after his own health and just ignoring everyone else's needs, but he is working tirelessly for his own people. And this is just inspirational to us. Amazing story.
Yeah. So without further ado, here's the interview. And we, again, really appreciate his time, and we'll definitely catch up with him in another 6 months to see how everything's going. So.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like, and share so we can find others like yourself.
Thank you for tuning in, everyone. Now, Gordon and I tend to have a policy where we don't do too much research before each podcast because we like to come in fresh. We figured you, the listeners, are listening to Bitcoin Basics because you're learning the basics. So if me and Gordon do a lot of research, we have that presumptive knowledge. So we try not to do too much research about our guests or the topics that we discuss. This case, we didn't do that. We were both very, very excited to speak to Lord. Now, how do we pronounce your name correctly, Lord? I want to get that right.
Fusitu'a.
Fusitu'a.
Yep.
So in this case, we kind of ignored our own internal policies, and we went ahead and listened to several of your previous podcasts because This one and previous podcasts that we did with Bitcoin Exashi, where he's running a Bitcoin Beach program, these are real world case scenarios. So we're just not talking to someone who is giving advice on buying and trading Bitcoin or stuff that's happening in, the US or Europe, which is great. But this is actually something that you are doing, which is making a real world on the grounds difference to people's lives. So yeah, we kind of, as you will pick up soon in this interview, I kind of was like a lapdog just drilling at the book, because this was an interview I was really excited to do. So we're back in. And so we didn't do this, but do you mind just giving everyone just a brief background as to who you are and what you're trying to do with Bitcoin in Tonga?
No worries. So my name's Lord Fusitu'a. I'm from a small country, a small island kingdom in the Pacific called Tonga. So Tonga is a kingdom, constitutional monarchy, and has been so for a while now. We've been ruled by the same royal family for the past 1,400 years. So we became a full democracy in 2010. That's where we're from. We're, along with Ethiopia, we're the only BIPOC nations never to have been colonized. So that's why we're still the only kingdom remaining in the Pacific. I myself am a barrister by trade, intellectual property, finance and banking law. I had my training at the Australian National University in Canberra, which is actually where I was born and raised. So A&E Law School, and then practiced law both in barristers' chambers and for legal aid in Canberra before I ended up moving back to Tonga. So barrister and solicitor of the ACT Supreme Court, barrister of the High Court of Australia. Went back to Tonga. My father ordered me back to take up my duties at the early 2000s. So gave up my dream of a silver 911 and a house at Point Piper for Tonga, and earning $7,000 a year as a Crown Counsel working for the government as a prosecutor. Worked as a prosecutor for a while, and then was moved across to administration. When I left Tonga, I went on a Ministry of Justice scholarship. My parents could have paid for me to go, but I was able to win a scholarship, so that's what I did. And that's why, even though I wanted to practice law as a trial lawyer, being a prosecutor, I was taken back by the Ministry of Justice to help administer the courts, and ended up as Deputy Secretary of Justice for Tonga. And then I married my now ex-wife and began working as general counsel for her mother's company, a company called TongaSat, which was Tonga's satellite company that leased satellite slots in space to other countries and to companies. Under ITU, International Telecommunications Law, only a sovereign nation can register satellite slots. But a friend of our king's, King Tupou IV, His late Majesty, who worked at Intelsat, spoke to the king during the 80s and noted to him that the Five Eyes in China had gone to sleep, as it were, over the 70s and 80s, and had not registered all the prime slots from about Pakistan and India through China, Southeast Asia, over the Pacific Ocean to the west coast of the United States. Most of those prime slots had not been registered. mainly because there's a gentleman's agreement at international law that you won't register a slot unless you can put a bird up there. So what Tonga did was it preempted that, and we registered all the slots we could get our hands on across that frequency spectrum. So even though, of course, there's no way we could afford to put a satellite up, legally, those slots were now ours. So anyone ended up being the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, Boeing, a number of other companies, tech companies, the NSA, all these people who wanted slots over the Pacific had to lease them from us. So I worked as the general counsel for that company, doing the legal negotiations for the leasing of those slots. Eventually, I moved back into private practice after my ex-wife and I parted ways. I moved into corporate practice, which is my specialty, even though I'd become a prosecutor. My specialties, as I said, intellectual property, banking and finance laws. So I went back into corporate practice and became a lawyer for a number of multinationals for their branch in Tonga. Ironically, and I still am, the lawyer on retainer for Federal Pacific Finance and Fexco Pacific, who own Western Union for about 2/3 of the Pacific. So, yeah, I had to end up disclosing to them my advocacy for Bitcoin. So I was presented with a choice of a fat retainer check every January or setting my whole country financially free. That's obviously a no-brainer choice. I chose the latter. I'm still on good terms with them. They are personal friends. The people that own the company, they knew it wasn't personal. It's, it's a matter of principle. I believe my people have a right to financial freedom. So it didn't cost the friendship. And then about a decade ago, my father passed. As per our constitution, I inherited the title, the Fusitu'a title. So I became Lord Fusitu'a and inherited the estates which come with that title, and therefore became eligible to be a Lord Member of Parliament to represent the constituency from which those estates are founded. My father had happened to be the sitting Lord Member at the time, so his seat was vacated upon his passing. We had to have a by-election where the Lords in my constituency voted me in and have done so ever since for the past decade until November last year, where I vacated my seat due to medical reasons. I'd been abroad for medical treatment for a couple of years. And during that medical treatment, I fell back down the rabbit hole and reacquainted myself with Bitcoin in a major way. And I had read the white paper back in 2013 and thought I understood it well. As with most of us, I found out much later that I had not gotten my head around it at all. And understood it more thoroughly much later with much more research and investigation. And I discovered, as everyone has, that Bitcoin is the most pristine asset that man has ever devised, that the digital scarcity that Steve Wozniak has observed can only ever be discovered once, and Bitcoin is Bitcoin because of that digital scarcity discovery. And discovered that, it's the most supreme store of value. As my friend Michael Saylor says, it's better at being fiat than fiat is. It's better at being gold than gold is. So for people that look like me in the OECD G7 G20 nations who had been marginalised from access to capital markets because either they couldn't afford it, or they've been gate-kept, or they were redlined from real estate markets, which are the basis of foundation of generational wealth in Western middle-class society, especially out of America. There was a new asset that had no barriers to entry, zero barriers to entry. So my Bitcoin is just as good as Elon Musk's Bitcoin. So for someone in an OECD nation, they could find generational wealth for lineages of people who had previously been had no access to capital markets at all. And for those who had access to capital markets, it was even better for them. But I also discovered that for those of us in emerging markets, the 4+ nearly 5 billion of us in emerging markets, Bitcoin's a life-saving technology. It's salvation for us from hyperinflation in Nigeria and Venezuela, where they need a wheelbarrow full of their own currency to buy a loaf of bread. And for those of us in GDP remittance-dependent countries, where a large part of our GDP is dependent on remittances and therefore dependent on the price gouging of the remittance industry, it saves us from that. Were we to use Bitcoin, it would be our salvation from that value scraping that's done by the remittance industry and the predatory commercial banks. So, that brought me to here. Sorry. Yep.
No, I was just going to, I mean, you're a politician, I think, so that you'd probably talk for 3 hours if we didn't interrupt you.
I'm a politician and a barrister. You have to.
Oh, there you go.
That's enough.
Only joking. You have a fascinating personal journey, and I'll get back to that in a minute, but I've always been fascinated with something like Western Union, that remittance industry, and everyone knows Western Union. What do they think about Bitcoin? And do you think they'll ever adopt it, or is it just always going to be enemy number one?
Well, Jack Mallers said something which is quite reserved. He said, Western Union would charge you $1 if they could afford to. At least 50% of the reason they charge you what they charge you is because it's very expensive for them to get the money to you. There are about, between you and El Salvador and the US remitter, Jack Mallers, talking to Peter McCormack, attested to a minimum of 11 intermediaries between sending it from New York to actually getting it to El Salvador. So Western Union has to get it through those 11 intermediaries, and that's why they have to charge a lot. That's not all the reason. A lot of it's greed still, but that's one of the reasons. So partially they charge that much because they have to. Partially they charge that much because they're gouging for profit. So you may not have seen MoneyGram last week is going into partnership, I think, with the Solana blockchain to try and make use of crypto remittances. Yeah, exactly. But they are investigating, working with El Salvador, if they can match. So El Salvador's back end is done by OpenNode. I know that because they've approached me to do our back end in time. If MoneyGram can work with OpenNode and make it cost effective for them, they will send remittances to El Salvador on Bitcoin on Lightning. So I'll send you guys the link to the article. It's an interesting article.
Yeah.
So the option is there for those remitters. If they want to, they can do what Jack Mallers has done with Strike. Effectively, it will become a race to zero because people will eventually go, we can send remittances for nothing. Why are we going to use Western Union again? So Jack Mallers has already made it for people in the US and El Salvador That's where Strike works at the moment. You can send Bitcoin for 0 fees.
Sorry,
go ahead.
With that, so obviously Bitcoin for Tonga solves a remittance issue, and you'll save a lot of money doing so. Are you looking at potentially a future Bitcoin economy in Tonga? Because, I mean, you are solving the remittance issue, but are you looking beyond that? Is by being a Bitcoin open sovereign state, are you looking at potentially bringing in jobs, bringing in digital nomads? Is that on the horizon as well?
Yeah, 100%. The entire spectrum of Bitcoin solutions we are open to 100%. So everything that Bitcoin can bring, which is jobs, digital nomads, Bitcoin mining at a nation state level, purchasing Bitcoin, everything that El Salvador is doing, we are open to. So if you guys make me co-host, I can show you sort of what the 4-step plan is.
All right.
I just need to be co-host so I can share my screen.
Okay. We'll take a pause in recording. Oh, yep.
No, you can keep recording.
Okay.
Yep. So, where are we? So obviously the first step is the commercial solution, which is changing GDP remittance dependence. So we reclaim that 30% of GDP. So everyone in the country gets 30% extra income, okay? So in emerging markets economies like Tonga, if informal economies that don't have a high level of manufacturing or professional industries, the government doesn't make their money from income tax. So they impose what's called a consumption tax on all consumer goods, so that you make money even if you're a cash-based fisher or farmer in the village. You still have to pay tax when you buy a stick of gum or you buy a net. So the 15% that government charges, if the whole country suddenly has 30% extra disposable income, they're going to spend that 30% into government's 15%. So government's 15% gets a 30% injection of new capital from overseas that wasn't there before. So the money that goes to hospitals, roads and schools from the government's 15% suddenly gets a 30% bump as well, right across the board. So that's the second win. The third win is that the fisherman or farmer in the village who lives on $150 a week, he now gets the full 100 instead of $70 in his remittance. So his natural tendency will be to increase his standard of living. So his kids go to school with breakfast now instead of without breakfast. Maybe he can afford an extra net if he's a fisherman, an extra hour of a tractor's time if he's a farmer. But eventually he's going to go, I got by on $70 instead of 100. It was hand to mouth, but I got by. So if I budget and try and get by on the $70 again, for the first time in the history of my family, there'll be someone who can afford savings. So that extra 30% then becomes savings. So that can become savings, which will educate their children, and eventually he'll get better jobs and uplift the family, or that 30% can build up their fishing or farming small business so that they are finally able to put away money for generational wealth. That's the third win. And then the fourth win is, remember, they're saving 30%, but they're not saving it in even in the strongest fiat, USD, which melts at 5% per annum. they're saving it in a protocol that appreciates at 200% per annum CAGR, cumulative annual growth rate, year on year since its inception. So their $30 to Bitcoin this year could be 60, could be $90 next year. So that's the fourth win. So that's just from the remittances. Instant and effectively free. The second part of the plan is, of course, you go legal tender so that they can spend and save those remittances they're sent. Yeah. So before legal tender is reached, before legal tender is reached, we will need an off-ramp for the remittances. So I had to take a part interest in effectively a crypto bank. Okay? So the reason I had to do that was that it provides me with access to, these are more OECD nation products. So DeFi Market Swap, which is the company that I co-own, similar to Celsius. You can get collateralize your Bitcoin and get a home loan. But more importantly is it gives me a Visa card that I can give for free to every Tongan so that they can get the remittances sent directly to the wallet on our proprietary app. So they can get the Bitcoin sent directly to the DeFi market wallet, which is connected to the Visa card, and they can then spend the Bitcoin natively. So there's no charge for changing Bitcoin into fiat. You send the remittance from Sydney or Auckland directly to that person's wallet address, and it's automatically spendable. I'm not sure if you've heard of the Wirex card, which a lot of people in emerging markets use, which is
I use one myself.
Yeah. There you go. So this is similar, except with us, you don't have to make that exchange into fiat to spend. You just spend it natively.
Now, is that Bitcoin only, or can I transfer my juicy XRP and Luna tokens?
You're sacrilege. Good Lord.
I'm being sarcastic, by the way.
Yeah, so it's DeFi. DeFi. So, you can send other currencies as well. I couldn't keep it Bitcoin only. I had to make some compromises for the other parties who are part owners in the company. So until then, until this is legal tender, the off-ramp will have to be the Visa card. Once it's legal tender, it's all right. You can spend the Bitcoin yourself. So legal tender is step 2. Step 3 then is the mining. So El Salvador does Bitcoin mining because it's clean, renewable energy. So that means your electricity costs, which is your major overhead when you're a miner, because I'm a miner myself personally. I have a couple of terahash worth of Bitcoin mining. So what do you do if you're Tonga? So if you're Tonga, you have 21 volcanoes for a population of only 100,000. So that makes one volcano, just as a trivia spot, that Niuafo'ou there, that's my estate. That's the island I own. So 21 volcanoes, population of 100,000, that means one volcano for every 5,000 people. So it only takes 2 megawatts of electricity to service 5,000 people. So 5,000 times 20 is 100,000. That's our population. 2 times 20, that's 40. So it only takes 40 megawatts for our entire national grid. Now, each of these volcanoes will produce 95 megawatts. So that's 2,000 megawatts.
Wow.
So we produce 2,000 megawatts. We only need 40. What do we do with the rest? With 400 megawatts, we provide every family in the country. That's only 20,000 families because there's only 100,000 people. Every family in the country with what's called a hash hut by some or an ant box by others. A 40-foot container jammed full of Bitcoin miners, A6, S19, J Pro Bitcoin miners. So this 40-foot container will produce about 4,000 USD a day in Bitcoin. Okay, so a family that's on $150 a week will now have a 40-foot container producing 4K USD a day for them. Yeah? 28K USD a week, or about 50K Australian a week for a family that's used to getting paid 150 Tongan dollars a week. So that effectively turns Tonga into a little Dubai. Instead of every family having an oil well, they'll have one of these. So because the Bitcoin community is funny like that, the tech for this and for this has been offered to me gratis. The tech, the maintenance, installation, Bitcoiners, especially big-time Bitcoiners, for some reason like seeing the little engine that could succeed.
Yeah.
So you guys will know what our community is like.
Right.
So, yeah. So that's gratis. And
I'm realizing now, sorry, I'm realizing now how stupid that question is. Will you miss the IMF and World Bank?
Yeah. So when we got, in 2014, Tonga got fibre to the door from the World Bank. So it's the last project we did with the World Bank at that level. And my mother was the Minister of Communications at the time. So she was the one who negotiated with the World Bank. And because she's cheap and wouldn't pay for their own lawyer, she got her son free to do their negotiations. And what I advised her to do was the World Bank kept coming back with, we can't give you the loan because after measuring your economic growth, there's no way you can service the debt. So I kept telling her the World Bank rep was also a woman. I kept telling her, tell the lady, can she tell you explicitly why we can't get the loan? So she's very diplomatic. She said, the economic growth just makes it seem that it's not going to be viable. So the words like not viable, not secure. And my mother I kept telling her, my mother went, that's enough. I mean, she's already said so. I said, no, just keep going, trust me. So eventually the lady said, Tonga's too poor to afford the loan. So as soon as she said that, I told my mother, excuse ourselves for 10 minutes and we'll go outside and come back in. So we went out and I told her, go back in and remind her that according to their own charter, the World Bank Charter, they have a category called an LDN, Least Developed Nation Status. If you're an LDN, then the World Bank, by their own charter, has to give you the money. If you've begun negotiations on a project and it ends up that you're an LDN, they have to give it to you as a grant. It's not a loan. So we went back in and my mother mentioned it to her, and then you could see the lady's eyes. She clicked, and then she saw what we'd been doing the whole time was when she mentioned we were too poor, we then qualified as an LDN. So we ended up getting the money as a grant. So because it was a grant, I told my mother, we're not going to get a deal like this ever again. So you should future-proof the network as much as possible. So what that meant was we got bandwidth enough for 1 million people, but there's only 100,000 of us. So I told her, get enough bandwidth so we won't have to upgrade for another 100 years. So we got enough bandwidth for 1 million people. We have about 2,000 or 3,000 gigabit up and down to the door. The whole country uses 5 gigabit. What we're going to do is I went into a deal with Cisco. We're going to make half of the container Bitcoin mining rigs and the other half data centers. So AWS's Southern Hemisphere headquarters are in Sydney, and they have their server farms in New South Wales and Victoria. So 0.01% of AWS's Southern Hemisphere business, which is headquartered out of Sydney, is worth $200 billion a year. Okay? So if we get 0.01% of their business, that's $200 billion a year for Tonga. So with a GDP of 500 million.
200 billion.
200 billion.
Wow.
Per annum. So
that's 8 times your current GDP. Wow.
Yeah. So no, not 8 times. Remember,
wow.
We're 500 million.
80.
So
that's
that's 400 times. So Tonga will get 400 years worth of economic activity. We get paid for 4 centuries of our economic activity in 12 months.
Okay, so this sounds absolutely amazing. And don't worry, I'm completely on board. And Faris and I, Bitcoin is one up. But to play devil's advocate a little bit, a country like Tonga, you know, what was it, 400 times increasing your GDP 400 times? Are you going to see American or Chinese aircraft carriers parked off the doorstep? Like, what's the opposition to this? Surely they're not going to let this sort of play out.
The US has not been upfront in the Pacific with protecting us from China. So it's going to be geopolitically almost impossible for them to come in and suddenly say, all right, we're going to stop you from prospering in case China has something to do with it. So if you've left us to fend for ourselves for the past 50 years, then there's no justification for you to come in and suddenly say, you can't do that because we've looked after you, so you've got to be looked after us, because they haven't looked after us. The Five Eyes have been completely negligent for the past 50 years. That's why, and you can go into Chatham House, you go into Wharton School, you go into any think tank in London or Washington, DC, and they will tell you, I can show you the studies. Their own studies say every year they warn the Five Eyes, stop being so negligent. China's getting in more. Stop being so negligent. So China's not going to mind because it just means that there's more kitty out there for them to take control of. If Tonga is extremely prosperous, then paying back all those loans in digital yuan becomes a viable proposition. So the more Tonga partners with them, the more their influence grows. So, it's going to be more geopolitically about each one deciding how much they are going to press the issue and step on the other's toes for fear of retaliation by the other side, not necessarily us. So we're not the issue. They are the issue to one another.
That's absolutely incredible. I mean, just looking at those machines, and those who are listening, you need to jump onto the YouTube and have a look. I mean, going from 500 million to potentially 200 billion in GDP is incredible.
So that's literally 400 years worth of our GDP in 12 months.
How's the internet going to work? I mean, infrastructure in terms of in Tonga,
so
you said is pretty good, but to the
they
mainland,
really rolled that out. So my estate, there's parts of my estate that there's no running water, no electricity. The government has not installed running water and electricity yet, but there's 5G. So when you're an emerging market, your beggars can't be choosers. So if the aid you're getting is internet, you take the internet. If your schools and roads haven't been upgraded yet, then too bad. You take what you can get when it's given. So we have to wait for the aid to come to upgrade our schools and roads, but at least we've got 5G internet. So the country is 99% internet penetration, 95% smartphone penetration. So I'm not sure if you've heard of Digicel. It's an Irish company that operates mostly out of the Caribbean, Africa, and the Pacific. It's a telco. So they completely, it's the one that Telstra's trying to buy. The Australian government is pushing Telstra to buy because Digicel put themselves on the market for $2 billion and Huawei was about to buy them. And Scott Morrison went, we can't have a Chinese company own all the mobile networks in the Pacific, because Digicel came in and beat out our local government telco in Tonga, in Samoa, in Fiji. So they ended up getting more profit from being the rails for digital fiat remittances. So what they do is they give out free phones to everyone so that your relatives in Sydney and Los Angeles can send you remittances to your handset. So they go online to the Digicel website and they send remittances to your Digicel, it's called mobile money, and they replace Western Union because now the person doesn't have to go into Western Union. Digicel still takes the 30%, but you get it to your phone. So the upshot of that was, ironically, Digicel has put in all the infrastructure that we'll use for Bitcoin. They gave out all the free smartphones and they installed all the point of sale cash registers that can take phone swipes at all the merchant shops. So all we do is we add one app to all those cheap Chinese Android smartphones that they've given everyone. Is Moon Wallet, Wallet of Satoshi, Strike, whatever you want. You put that on the phone, and then you put the BTC Pay server software on the point of sale iPad, and there you've got your commercial solution.
So if my calculations are correct, I'm here in Australia, by the way, you have 100 times faster internet than I do. And I pay about $80 a month for it.
Yeah, pretty much. So I can have my Xbox One, my PlayStation 5, my Netflix, my HBO Max, my Hulu, all going at once and all at 4K.
Wow. So what's the digital nomad scene
tomorrow?
Yeah, what's it like in Tonga, digital nomad scene? Because I'd love to visit.
It's pretty quiet because this is not widely known yet. I don't think even our just the bandwidth issue, which makes it extremely attractive for digital nomads. If they knew that you can run, you can log into your company's VPN and have a stable connection 24 hours a day. So you're effectively working as part of your company's intranet while you're in Tonga. That's how much bandwidth there is, stable bandwidth. So, yeah, citizenship, there's an investment pathway, which is a lot because it was built around Chinese, rich Hong Kongese in around 97, when Hong Kong went back to China, a lot of merchants fled Hong Kong with their money and came to the Pacific. So Tonga has a 5 million fiat investment path, which is misleading because it's not necessarily investment. You just have to have a bank account in Tonga in your name or your company's name and deposit 5 million Tongan into it. So you're not investing in anything. You can just put money into your account. But because of fractional reserve banking, which is how fiat central banking, as we know, the problems with fiat is one, central banking, the value purchase price is controlled centrally. The second is that the distribution of fiat is done by fractional reserve banking by commercial banks. So your 5 million gets to Tonga, so the Tongan bank can then loan out 90% of it and only keep 10% for you, just the same way fractional reserve banking works everywhere. So that's the reason for the 5 mil path. The other path is naturalisation, either by marriage or living there for 5 years.
What percentage of Tongan adult population is unbanked?
Between about 65 and 70 is the last World Bank figures.
Okay. Are there microfinance programs available for them?
Yeah, they come and go. So we have what's called a National Development Bank, which was built by His late Majesty Dubois IV when he modernised Tonga to provide loans to farmers. So they're agricultural loans. They're not given out commercially to commercial clients. So de facto, it's microfinancing, but it's from a national development bank. And then there are local programs that have come and gone in various villages. There'll be a person there who's got connections to someone who's done microfinancing before in Africa or in the Caribbean, and they come and help them out, get that program going, and then it'll die off after a year or two. So nothing permanent.
Because that was something that popped in my head when you're mentioning that people will be saving X amount because they're receiving Bitcoins, is that's not just a saving, that is a potential opportunity that they can use it as capital.
That's right.
So is that on the framework as a potential Bitcoin microfinance program?
Yeah, 100%. Everything that comes with Bitcoin. Microfinancing, Bitcoin bonds like Naib's done. So that 4-step is the skeleton. That's the core structure. And then all the ancillary benefits will be pursued on a case-by-case basis. If there's one and there's private sector interest in it and we've got people who've come up with the money for it and we can get it going, then we'll do that particular one. So there won't be a sort of buckshot attempt to do everything on the spectrum. Things that come up one by one as being viable will be pursued to the extent of its viability.
All right, so there's a lot going on here. Me and Gordon are gobsmacked actually by just what you're doing. How can our listeners get involved? What can they do to help? And also just thinking about the relief that is required recently. But for people listening, what is the key message you want to get out to them?
Well, from your end, I would advocate with your local representatives, your state representatives. The more that Bitcoin gets recognized internationally, the more viable it is for small emerging markets countries to do so. So encourage your own political representatives to support it. At a macro level, that would be great for Tonga. And encourage them to be supportive of emerging markets like Tonga, who are looking to, I don't like this phrase, but to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, who are trying to use Bitcoin to, generate wealth for themselves and move themselves away from being dependent on those metropolitan countries' development aid. So, support for that at a macro level. And then at a micro level, we've got the Liquidity for Tonga project, which is on Telegram. I'll send you guys the link for it. And that's a program that wasn't even established by me. We were all members of a liquidity program for El Salvador, which is node owners. So I run a number of Bitcoin nodes. So node owners around the world who connect to each other in liquidity rings and then connect to El Salvador to provide El Salvador with liquidity rings that their diaspora can access to send remittances through frictionlessly and cheaply to El Salvador. So without my knowing, two gentlemen from our group began Liquidity for Tonga and began recruiting people to build liquidity rings for the same purpose for Tonga. So they ended up telling me, and I ended up joining up. So we have a Telegram group, and everyone there has nodes which we have in various rings of liquidity, which we daisy chain together. I'm not sure how much you guys are into Lightning and how it works.
We've covered Lightning in the show. Yeah.
Yep. So so because it's a full Bitcoin node, it is also then a Lightning node. So we get Lightning liquidity rings that are then channeled to Tonga, so that Tonga is the endpoint. So you can be, and curiously enough, they did their research. So they looked for members in cities where there are high concentrations of Tongan diaspora. So Auckland, Sydney, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And if you're diaspora there, then you just connect to one of the nodes and you can send frictionless remittances back through Tonga, and it'll go through our Lightning liquidity rings. And then finally, there's a fund. This is only since the volcano and the tsunami. So this very ironic. When the volcano and the tsunami hit, our comms, both voice and data, were completely wiped out. Legacy comms, because our undersea cable, which brings fibre to the door, was severed in two places. Our satellite backup collapsed. So no voice or comms could get in or out. But while I've been in hospital, do you guys know Samson Mo?
Blockstream, yeah.
Blockstream. So Samson sent me a couple of Blockstream base units to hospital as get well gifts, which I sent back to Tonga. So awesome. Ironically, the only thing that got into Tonga for the fortnight when comms were down were all the Bitcoin donations that we airdropped from the Blockstream satellite to my base units in Tonga.
Oh, wow.
So, when everything else failed, only Bitcoin still worked.
Isn't it funny? Like people talk about, if the internet goes down and whatever, Bitcoin's not going to work. I mean, that's absurd anyway. You got more problems, but actually, no, that's not even true. It can still actually work.
When Bitcoin went down, it was the only thing that worked. And that's precisely because the block sizes are kept at a level which you can transmit over radio waves. So unfortunately, there was no voice, so I couldn't call them to instruct them. What we could have done was form a mesh network, which is just connect everyone's Wi-Fi routers to one another, all the cell phone towers and radio wave towers to one another, and have an internal national intranet. And you can just transact in Bitcoin across the whole country without any internet access whatsoever. And then just sync it on chain afterwards when the internet comes back on.
Or even the satellite.
Yeah, it was crazy. And Samson, we were very thankful to Samson. So that liquidity came from donations to the Bitcoin fund. I'll find the link somewhere for the Bitcoin donation page. So that's how people can help. And
that's awesome. I mean, you personally have an amazing story, but also, we talk about Bitcoin solving everything, which it doesn't. But in Tonga and perhaps some of your neighboring countries as well, it kind of does solve a lot of problems. So,
it does. So if it weren't for Bitcoin mining, there'd be no reason for the volcano Bitcoin mining, and therefore there'd be no reason for us to get this electricity generation infrastructure for free. So that electricity generation, remember I said 2,000 megawatts, 40 for the national grid, 400 for this stuff. That still leaves 1,560 megawatts with nothing to do. So what do? We can now do what Canada does to New York and New Jersey. We can export electricity to Samoa, Fiji, Tuvalu for cost that's below any of their costs, because most of the Pacific, 90%, we use the most expensive form of power, which is the 1970s diesel generators that we got when the Five Eyes still did infrastructure aid. So, most of the Pacific uses diesel generators, which is the dirtiest and most expensive way to get power. So we can give them clean power much more cheaply than they're getting now, and still at a rate which will profit Tonga billions.
But I thought Bitcoin mining was causing climate change.
I know, right? So ironically, my daytime job is as the chairman of GOPAC for Oceania, global Organisation of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. So we do that with the UNODC and with NATO and with Interpol. We trace illicit, it actually has a lot to do with crypto and Bitcoin. We trace illicit financial flows to the Middle East and to ISIS, and with the triads out of China, and from the cartels in South America. And then my other daytime job is the chairman of the Commonwealth's Pacific Parliamentary Group, which does human rights, gender equality, and climate change. So we have to go around member nations and assess how closely they're keeping to their promises of 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement. And Bitcoin is the greenest industrial sector on the planet. So the American National Grid, 12% renewable. North American Bitcoin mining, 65% renewable.
And Tonga's will be 100% geothermal.
Exactly, 100% renewable. So, but Bitcoin's boiling the oceans, apparently.
Yeah.
So from people who are worst hit, part of my GOPAC job is to go in to countries and set up their anti-corruption commissions for them. So I went into Kiribati and set up the anti-corruption commission, set up the anti-corruption committee in their parliament. But some days we'd have to hop on the desk in the hotel room because at high tide, the seawater comes in about a foot high in your room because their country's sinking. Oh. So climate change in the Pacific, we are the worst hit. But so we know the science, and the science is Bitcoin mining is the same as Christmas lights. Or Siri and Alexa use more electricity than Bitcoin.
It's like 0.2% or something ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly. It's less than 15 basis points.
When the critics don't know what to criticize Bitcoin for, that's just the laziest argument they go to is the electricity.
Well, there's that. And of course, who loses the most from Bitcoin? Legacy finance.
Yeah.
Who owns legacy media? Legacy finance.
Yeah, exactly.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like, and share so we can find others like yourself.
It's called a consultation. I had to take a package of legislation that was introduced by not the former government in Tonga, the one before that, which sought to amend the constitution and effectively turn us into a banana republic. So they wanted to take the authority of the judiciary and the legislature and put it all under cabinet. So we've been a full democracy for 12 years now. So 2010, our monarch, whose family has ruled us peacefully for 1,412 years, just decided in 2010, I think it might be a good idea to be a full democracy. So he's the first monarch since, Charles I had, what's his name, chomping at his heels. Since the Roman Empire. He's the first full monarch since the Roman Empire to voluntarily cede all executive power. Wow. So being a young democracy, there have been growing pains, and then two governments ago decided we'll give it a crack, see if we can run the whole thing and put the judiciary and the legislature under themselves in cabinet, and then effectively have the PM run the whole country like a president, but without separation of powers. Yeah. So I argued that it was contrary to the Constitution, number one, but even if it weren't, to amend the Constitution at that fundamental level triggers our provision in our parliamentary house rules that requires a 2-week public consultation of all legislation. So we don't have referendum legislation. So this is the closest thing to a referendum. So I had to travel around every single village in the country, doing 4 hours in the morning, 4 hours at night, and pretty much explain the legislation to every single person in the country. So it was pretty hectic. It went for 2 months. I got back, I collapsed, and I didn't realise that I'd already been ill throughout. So I collapsed and I died in Tonga. Mm-hmm. So they revived me and then kept me alive for 36 hours while they scoured the Pacific for an air ambulance. Our closest always, obviously, is Auckland. Auckland didn't have one spare. Next is Sydney. Sydney didn't have one spare. So they gave Brisbane a crack, and fortunately there was one there. So an air ambulance flew in from Brisbane, medevaced me to here, and because I'd already died, it was, touch and go, as you can expect. Mm-hmm. So the OR staff were literally on the tarmac and began operating en route to Middlemore and then at Middlemore. And then over the next 3 days, I died another 2 times and they revived me again. So, it took me 3 deaths to finally realise that Bitcoin's the most pristine asset on the planet. And
I think that's the best post-death story ever.
Most people get an easier path to orange pilling. I had to die 3 times to, So I'd been, as you would have heard from me and Pedro's interview, I'd been exposed to it in 2013, had it ripped away from me, and then again in 2016, had it ripped away from me, and then in 2019, I was on my back for the better half a year, couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't swallow even. I wasn't allowed a sip of water for half a year, so they just rub ice cubes on your lips because the throat had collapsed when they slid it open to put the air pipe in. So if I swallowed, it goes straight into the lungs. So they didn't close my throat up until after about 5 or 6 months. So I got fed through a tube that went through the nose and then down the esophagus straight into the stomach. And so there's nothing else much to do for those 6 months. I couldn't even hold a phone in 2 hands, so I could at least play Scrabble or something. Or I could only hold in one hand and swipe with a thumb. So as you would have heard on that podcast, I went rabbit holing to the max. So I pretty much read every word that's ever been printed about Bitcoin, every uttered audio word that's ever been recorded or video that's been broadcast, and came to the realization, as everyone who gets orange pill does, that Bitcoin's the most pristine asset on the planet. It's sound money, which we haven't had since the florin. It provides barrierless entry to capital markets that people that look like me previously did not have access to. And that's for an OECD country. For an emerging market, that's not a long time preference. It can change our world now. It can reclaim our GDP by providing us remittance rails that are instant, peer-to-peer, international, no intermediaries, instantly and for free, rather than the 30% that the remittance industry value price gouges and value scrapes from the poorest of our population. So, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Lord. Yeah, this is something I've been taking notes on, listening to your other podcasts. And I've got a lot of questions, so I'm just trying to figure out which to go first with. But for people hearing you for the first time, Tonga's GDP is around 550 million a year. 40% of that is remittances, which is your diaspora overseas sending money back home. That's fascinating to me hearing you say you have people who've never been to Tonga and are third generation sending money back home.
You're sending money back home.
Yeah, and that's something I want to talk to you about later as well, just that intergenerational family and legacy that we, because I grew up in the Middle East.
So you can measure the strength of our culture by actual tangible economic metrics, because because it's so strong, it triggers remittances being sent back by people who have never even seen their homeland. So that's something.
Yeah, that's something I was surprised by. Would you say, okay, I understand the short-term solution to Bitcoin, because when you are paying, and I back of the envelope here, about 38 million a year, you're giving up in remittances. That 30% that would go to someone like Western Union.
Well, about 14. So we're getting about 60 million a year in 40%, 200. Yeah, 60 million in fees.
Oh, wow, that you're losing 60 million.
So of the 510, 200 are remittances, 200 million.
Yep.
And then
19% of that is remittances.
Fees. Yeah.
Wow. So Western Union or who was getting that?
Yeah, so about 19%.
Western Union and the banks. The banks less so for two reasons. Number one, 70% or 65, between 65 and 67% of the country is unbanked anyway. And the banks charge a lower price. The banks are about 5 to 10%. The remittance industry is around 30%. Even if on their website it says 10%, it says 10%, then there's a little asterisk. And the asterisk says at the bottom, Western Union also makes profits from being a currency exchange business. So they charge you for the spread. So the spread adds up to 30%.
So if Tonga's overseas, we're sending money back home using Bitcoin instead of Western Union or PayPal or whatever, you'd instantly have a 30 or 40% more money.
Instantly. So it means, so one of them has to eat the cost. If you send 100, they get 70. So that means Tonga eats the cost. If you want them to get 100, you have to send 130, so the diaspora eats the cost. Usually they just send 100, so Tonga eats the cost. So it'll be the GDP in Tonga that is reclaimed. For a portion, it'll be the diaspora that's reclaiming the 30, but for the majority, it'll be Tonga. So Tonga reclaims that 30%. So that means every person in the country, because effectively everyone receives remittances, even the royal family receives remittances. So everyone in the country gets 30% extra disposable income. Yeah. So that's, if you're an American, that's like having federal income tax removed completely.
So I know, us in Western countries, Bitcoin and people trade and whatnot, but it seems like, and I know, I'm not sure what the political correct term is nowadays, emerging market, it's not developing country, but it seems like Tonga's rife with Bitcoin. So you've got, volcanoes, geothermal stuff, you've got, remittances, payments, all that kind of stuff.
It's just, the stars have aligned for Tonga for what reason, I don't know. It just happens to be the intersection of all the optimal sort of elements that you'd want for Bitcoinizing an emerging market nation. So instead of being a consumer investment choice for an OECD metropolitan citizen, where it's a store of value and it'll appreciate to bring you wealth and eventually work towards a medium of exchange, and then finally, somewhere down the line, unit of account. In emerging markets, back to front. So medium of exchange first, like in El Salvador, and remittance rail. So same, that's a medium of exchange for us. And then once we receive it and being afforded the extra value that Bitcoin gives you, then people who have never afforded to have savings, not just themselves, their entire lineage for generations back. No one's ever afforded to have savings because it's always hand to mouth. So you're the first person in 1,000 years of your family's lineage who can afford savings. So then you move to store of value. So we begin medium exchange, store of value, OECD, store of value, medium exchange. So it shows you how pristine the asset is. Back to front still works perfectly. So it's not a consumer investment choice for emerging markets. It's a lifesaver. It's a salvation. It's like a buoy in an ocean of water where there's no land in sight. It's like a lifeboat. If you're in Venezuela or Nigeria and your pay packet devalues between the time you pick it up at work and the time you get to the shop, the currency is devalued in those 2 hours. You put it in Bitcoin and it holds the value. So it doesn't get melted away. And if you're remitting value like we are, it reclaims the value that the remittance industry just scrapes. So yeah, it's a survival choice for us.
So just on that, how do when you're evangelizing Bitcoin, how do you relate the price, the short term, and I say short term, 18-month price volatility of Bitcoin, where it can drop 50 to 80% in a few weeks? How does that affect your mission? How does it affect the adoption rate for Bitcoin when people are using it in the short term as remittance?
So do you mean after legal tender?
No, so from my understanding, you're trying to get Bitcoin. So your Bitcoin journey is to get it as remittance. So rather than people using Western Union or banks, get them to use Bitcoin.
Yeah, in the immediate term. So in the immediate term, that's a commercial, a commercial solution which doesn't require any government intervention. All it requires is remitters to take. I see your point. I'm giving you the context. So all it requires is remitters to choose Bitcoin rather than fiat, and ultimately, and most importantly, is for merchants to accept it. Yeah. In exchange for goods and services. So the retail sector in Tonga, there are no ethnic Tongans that own retail in Tonga anymore.
That's like Chinese, the 5% Chinese.
Yeah. So our population is 5% Chinese, and they completely decimated the Tongan retail sector in the late 90s, early 2000s. Much to the chagrin of Tongan businessmen, but much to the pleasure of Tongan consumers, because Tongan consumers got cheaper goods. Their shops, because by law, Tonga's a devout Christian country. Our constitution is the only one on the planet that forbids trading on Sunday by law. You're not allowed to make noise on Sunday. If you're having a loud party, the police will come and tell you to turn the music down. So
Switzerland.
Yeah. So Tongan stores don't open on Sunday. Chinese stores, someone will be in the store and it'll be shut, but you can go around the back and they'll give you. Chinese are open 24/7, 7 days a week. Rain or shine, Chinese shops never close. So for the consumers, it's great, but it decimated our retail sector. So what's the upshot of that? The upshot of that is Chinese merchants take any currency, and they know more about Bitcoin than Tongan locals. So what they do for all currencies is face value. So if you turn up, you're a Tongan diaspora, you just got off the plane from LA, you're on your way back from the airport, you stop off at a drugstore, you want to buy a can of Coke, you go in, I've only got USD. The Chinese merchant goes, yeah, no worries, but only face value. I'm not a currency exchange, so dollar for dollar. Your American dollar, you give it to me, and that's worth $1 Tongan dollar. So the merchant, of course, because $1 US, it takes 3 Tongan dollars to equal $1 US, so he's making a profit. So they do the same for the Bitcoin. They go, yeah, this is how much Bitcoin equals $1 Tongan dollar. The Tongan remittance recipient has no idea what the day's rate is, and it's too complicated to calculate anyway. So they'll go, yeah, here you go. They'll pay for their can of Coke with the remittance they got from their cousin. So strictly speaking, the central bank could come in and say, you're acting, as soon as you give them fiat for Bitcoin, you're acting as an exchange. You're acting as a currency broker. And for that, you need a financial operator's license, and you don't have that. So we can close you down. So strictly speaking, they could do that. No one has, because, they just can't be bothered. Strictly speaking, they could until it's legal tender. But then also, strictly speaking, the Chinese merchants, and they know this, could say, at international law, under all the UN financial conventions, once a country, whatever is the currency of a sovereign nation, even though the New Zealand dollar is worth about 40 cents, everywhere in the world has to accept the New Zealand dollar as foreign currency, because it is the currency of a sovereign nation. So on the 7th of September 2021, every nation on the planet, strictly speaking at international law, had to accept Bitcoin as foreign currency the day El Salvador made it legal tender. So that's the counter argument.
So with that, and with El Salvador, that obviously created some ripples with the IMF and World Bank, in that they basically threatened that they'd remove them from the 8th Circuit. Is this a consideration in Tonga where almost 20% of your GDP is foreign aid? And did you actually have to make that trade-off? Like, if we accept Bitcoin here, we may be black sheep, cut off from foreign aid.
Yeah. So our current king, he was our prime minister in the early 2000s. So in the early 2000s, we got a loan from the IMF and the World Bank, and the conditions of the loans were the austerity measures that were popular in the early 2000s. So austerity measures means cut public spending for social services. If you're an African nation, cut any spending on your tertiary mining industry. On your tertiary industries like manufacturing and telecommunications. You're not allowed to spend the loan on that because you might develop into a developed nation yourself, but we want you to remain as a mine. So you're only allowed to spend that money on extractive industries like mining. If you're a Tonga, so you're a plantation and an aquarium. So you can spend that money on fisheries and agriculture, but not on telecommunications. And you have to cut public servants' wages by 40%. So,
which you guys had rights about.
Yeah. So in the 1400-year history of our country, that caused the only rights we have ever had. And the king, when he was prime minister, is still incorrectly blamed directly for that it was his government's fault that these rights occurred, but they were just implementing the World Bank, IMF conditions. If we didn't implement it, we wouldn't get the loan. So the king, rightly, in my opinion, I can't speak for him, but I'm assuming would not be too unhappy seeing the back of an institution that has put a black mark on his name forever. Or, he wouldn't be. It's exactly like Naib's answer to Pedro in their interview when Peter McCormack interviewed Nayib Bukele. Peter went, well, what about if these people get angry? And Nayib said, well, these people haven't really been so nice to us in the past. So why should we be worried about what they think? Exactly. They've never been good to us. Yeah.
And you still owe, well, not you personally, but you still owe debt to the World Bank, or?
Marginally. Most of it's gone because, we moved more to the ADB, and it was a combination, ADB and China, because the only reason we loan off them is for infrastructure. And the Five Eyes stopped doing infrastructure in the 70s, much to their loss. And if you want a school or a hospital or roads done, China will give it to you practically for free, either for a soft loan or as a grant. So that's where 67% of our foreign debt is Chinese owned.
And you had a recent visit by the foreign minister.
That's right. Yeah. So Samoa's gone the full hog. If you go to Samoa's main waterfront road, you can look end to end and there is no building that is not Chinese built. All the government buildings are Chinese built. We're about halfway. Solomon Islands about 2/3. Samoa's full hog. Excuse me.
Yeah, this is the next leg that Bitcoin is. It's not just an online peer-to-peer currency. It is now part of macro geopolitical discourse. Absolutely. And it's going to be a key player. Yeah.
Absolutely, 100%. So Bitcoin, geopolitics is not a zero-sum game. So China banning Bitcoin mining by private citizens and then mining Bitcoin itself quietly by the government, those are not mutually exclusive events. Those events can be occurring simultaneously, and I can almost guarantee you that they are. Because China's not afraid of the USD. In China's, the Chinese don't plan in terms of 4-year election cycles or even generations. The Chinese plan in terms of centuries. Yeah. So I have sat in the Chinese Communist Party headquarters in Beijing as a state-invited member of parliament, and I had their Minister of Foreign Affairs tell me the 19th century was the British Empire, 20th century was the American Empire, 21st century is ours. We are claiming it. And in their foray to make the digital yuan the world reserve currency, they think nothing of the US dollar. It's a dead currency. Bitcoin, they're concerned about because that can't be controlled by any government. So that falls beyond the remit of them showering Ghana with money so that you have entire townships in Ghana that have no English signs at the stores. They're all in Mandarin because it's a mining town. And China has set up rails to replace the IMF World Bank rails. The rails that the IMF and the World Bank laid to the mines in Africa, to agriculture in South America, to fisheries and agriculture in the Pacific, to feed the metropole countries, the EU and France with the CFA countries, the old British Empire through the Commonwealth, the US through everywhere. China's just gone in and doubled up on all those rails in every one of those places to replace the IMF and the World Bank rails, and gone, they're going to make you do austerity measures. Come with us. It's free. Their foreign policy discourse is very subtle. They ask nothing in return at face value. So everything is no strings attached. But obviously there are very intrinsic strings attached. So when they build you a hospital, there'll be a play act at tendering it out, but it will always go to CCECC, the Chinese-owned government construction company. And all the architects, right down to the guy that pushes the wheelbarrow from the cement mixer to the hole, he's imported from China. Even that low level of labour, they don't use local labour. So everything is brought over from China. So all the money goes back to China. You get a free hospital. I mean, you can't complain about that. But the money goes back to China. We had our first human trafficking case in 2016 because they go to the extent of flying out human trafficked females to service the construction workers in brothels inside the construction compound. And one of these girls got loose from the construction compound and ran to the nearest house in the village, knocked on the door, they took it to the cops, and this time discovered its first human trafficking case. So that's the extent to which they are a closed garden. Their ecosystem is, they come right in, you'll get the hospital, but all that capital is going back to China. It's not going to employ anybody. It's not going to spend money in your economy because all the goods are brought from China. Even their food's brought over from China. So, yeah.
That reminds me of that.
Sorry, go Gords. Now you go.
I was just going to say, it reminds me of a movie. Who was the movie with, when the mafia is basically handing out, free food to the neighborhood and like everyone's excited and whatnot. It sort of reminds me of that. But,
all right.
We all know the use cases of Bitcoin, but where's the reality versus the theory? Like, for example, when are you going to be able to pay with digital yuan versus Bitcoin Lightning in Tonga?
Digital yuan, I mean, that's entirely up to Chinese foreign policy. What they'll do is what the US did with Saudi Arabia with the petrodollar. There'll come a time where as the Saudis and the Arabs did in the 70s, they went, you want to buy petrol, you've got to pay for it in USD. We're not going to accept any other currency for petrol. So China will eventually go, because every country, including the US, their largest creditor is China. And when China eventually goes, okay, all the debt has to be paid in digital yuan, we're not going to take anything else. That's when the digital yuan edges close to becoming world reserve currency. Excuse me. So Tonga, we've been using layer 1 to send remittances for a while now anyway, because it's cheaper than Western Union, even with the layer 1 fees, base layer fees, base layer speed, still faster than Western Union. So come Lightning, it's a no-brainer. So bill goes up in October.
Can you talk about that, if you don't mind? I think our listeners will be really fascinated with your legal tender bill.
Yeah, so the legal tender bill is pretty much a copy of the bill from El Salvador. So I'm good friends with Luis Rodriguez, the head of the central bank in El Salvador. So they were kind enough to give me a copy ahead of time. I've done what's called a gap analysis. So you usually, when you have legislation, you send it to the AG's, Attorney General's Department. They run it through the Constitution and all the relevant legislation to make sure it doesn't contradict any of the Tonga legislation. Usually takes about 2 or 3 months. I was in hospital. I used to work at the AG, so I was the secretary for our Law Reform Commission. So I did the gap analysis myself in a week. So they gave it to me last year in May. So by June, the bill was ready. So the bill's been ready since June. All it needed was to be tabled. So I was stuck outside of Tonga because of COVID. Tonga closed its borders in March 2020 and had zero COVID until January 2022. When we had to open the borders for first responders to come in after the volcano, then Omicron shot to the thousands within 5 days. And yeah, because it's a small place. So, couldn't get in. So Parliament only sits from June till November, late October, early November. June, you have to do the budget by law. July's constituency visits by law. August, September, government legislation by law. Then October, private members' bills are allowed to come up. So my bill, which is a legal tender bill, which doesn't force Bitcoin upon anyone, but makes it legal tender, 1, so that it's an option, and 2, it does make merchants have to accept it if proffered. So just like El Salvador, you can't discriminate against it. So,
how likely is that to succeed, the bill?
Well, I've got, what do we got? House is 26. The Lords are 9. We vote in a block always. Or we didn't in the Prime Minister's election in January, but that was an aberration. We usually vote as a 9-vote block because there are 9 Lords in the House and 17 People's Reps. So I've been the Lord member for the past decade. I vacated my seat at the general election in November. It was going on to the 3rd year of me being abroad for medical treatment. In good conscience, I couldn't go another year on the taxpayer's dime while being abroad. So I vacated my seat, and the Lords vote for each other in Tonga. The 17 People's Reps are voted for by universal suffrage, just like everywhere else. The Lords, in the UK, you become a Lord member just by virtue of being a Lord. With us, you actually have to get elected from your constituency. So in my constituency, there are only 3 of us. So myself and my 2 cousins. So they've voted me in for the past decade. One is a prince, the other is a farmer. Neither have any interest in politics. So they've always said, that's why you're the one of us that went to school and did all that law rubbish so that you could go to Parliament and do our job. So I've been quite happy to do that for the past decade. But I had to ask the Prince go in for me because we needed, especially because it was a general election, that meant there would be an election for a new Prime Minister. So the nobles needed every physical body to be in the House to vote, because that's the only thing I couldn't do from abroad. I did all my committee work. I submitted all my legislative policy remotely from Auckland, but I couldn't vote because you have to physically be there. So my cousin went in. So he'll tabled a bill for me. 9 of us are Lords. So that's a block. There's 17 people's reps. Out of the 17, there are 3 that are already Bitcoiners through their own private journeys. So 3 and 9 is 12. In a House of 26, 14 is a majority. So that leaves me with 14 other MPs to get 2 votes from.
Wow. So it seems unlikely.
Well, this is what we're hoping. The volcano and the tsunami may have put us in a difficult position because, it's completely decimated our economy. It's wiped out our crops. So there will be a famine in about 30 days because there will be no harvest. So we'll be entirely dependent on imported food, but have no money with which to buy it. The ash, which is still floating in, has made our rainwater acid rain, so no rainwater. Groundwater has been poisoned by the ash, so no groundwater. So all the water has to be imported as well, which we cannot afford. So if there were any delay, it would be because, the country is simply decimated. But all things being equal, my cousins, I speak to him at least twice a week, and our conversations always end with, remember you're putting my bill up? And he's like, yeah, of course. I know.
Don't forget.
Yeah, don't forget. So, goes up in October. So that will make it legal tender, but then you need all the ancillary legislation. So you need the legislation for merchants. We'll need the legislation to begin doing the mining, which means we've got to set up a state-owned enterprise to facilitate the mining with the commercial partners. There's got to be legislation to provide for and allow the drilling and exploration undersea and underground. So all the logistical rollout, you need legislation for every part of that. So that's not going to be a big deal. It's just a matter of getting it done. And then the legislation for rolling out what will hopefully be international cabling. So I'm not sure how much of my plan you guys saw on Peter's podcast.
Well, so what I'm familiar with is that you have a huge infrastructure in place for telecommunications in Tonga. So how many of the islands already have 5G network capacity?
So the whole country is 5G.
Yeah.
So the last big chunk of money we got, ironically, from the World Bank and the IMF were, guys, can you give me half an hour? There is an ambulance here to give me some treatment.
Okay.
Okay.
About 30 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Possibly.
Okay.
So how long do you want to talk to them for?
It's an international podcast interview.
Yeah. Yep, that's cool. How long do you think? How long, roughly?
We can sort of...
it'll be a while.
Easy.
It'll be a while because, I want to cover all your questions thoroughly.
Okay. Thank you.
Let me get this done, and I'll hit you guys
We'll
back.
leave this open.
All right, cheers. Wow,
Yeah.
thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
No worries.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like, and share so we can find others like yourself.
Now we could go.
Yeah, 100%.
We could go on and on, because you personally have a fascinating story and a fascinating life, and also we want to talk about Tonga and whatnot.
Yeah.
But maybe you could just put on your touch your crystal ball for a second. What's the roadmap for the next 5 years in Tonga?
I think it's that. I think it's what you've seen already. So the GDP remittance dependence should be within the next 12 months. The mining within the next 24 months, at the latest, because Parliament will close in November, and Tonga has what's called Prayer Week in January. So, Parliament really won't open. It usually opens in January, February a little bit, just to finish off last year's work, and then closes until the official opening in June. So the ancillary legislation, the soonest I can get it there, would be the February sitting. So that means that getting the legislation into the House, out of the House, back to the Attorney Generals, sent to the Palace, in the Palace office, before Privy Council, HM signs it into law, back to the government and gazetted and becomes law. That'll take at least till May, June. And if we're unlucky, then we won't even be able to get the ancillary legislation in till the June sitting. So that means the mining will begin after the ancillary legislation. So 24 months sort of outer for the mining. And then within 24 to 36 months, that's for the nation state, the national level mining, 24 months, 36 months at the most for local level mining. This shouldn't follow too far after, because the generation of the electricity, which is the major part, comes automatically with the volcano mining. So as soon as that's done, all the power to do this is there anyway. So probably 30 to 32 months. And then we'll begin as Michael Saylor's done for MicroStrategy. Tonga's current $700 million US treasuries, national treasuries. If we were to put them into Bitcoin in March 2020, by February 21, they would have been worth 25 billion. So in 11 months, we would have 725, more than quadrupled. We would have got effectively 3 decades of economic activity in 11 months. So because Bitcoin satisfies all the elements of money, much more superior to the 5,000-year-old store of value or the traditional medium of exchange. We'll then move what hopefully by then will be national treasuries in the billions into Bitcoin, which will give us returns. And then we will have to, I've deliberately delayed this to the last, begin taxation and regulatory laws for Bitcoin as both income and as property. So, the final part will be what OECD nations are going through now, which is why Biden employed 40,000 new lawyers in the last 11 months at the IRS, which is to figure out a taxation regime for Bitcoin and a regulatory framework. So that's at about 40 months.
That's probably why they banned mining in New York, because mining is essentially KYC-free Bitcoin.
Exactly. So, which means effectively, for the purposes of, this is the ATO's guide. So effectively, for the purposes of the ATO, it's tax-free because you're not going to do any of these things with it. And I'll make sure that when Tonga does it, in the US, if you want tax-free Bitcoin at a large capital level for your average middle-class person, then you're looking at switching your 401k into a Roth IRA, and then making it a self-directed Roth IRA, and then incorporating an LLC to run that Roth IRA, and that makes any Bitcoin out tax-free. So coming in at 40k, you sell it at 100k, that 60k is tax-free in America if you do it that way, through a Roth IRA, a self-directed Roth IRA with an LLC. In Australia, you get a self-managed super fund.
Yeah, that's what I
And you get the self-managed super fund. You incorporate yourself individually. You're the only director, only shareholder. You manage that. That means on the out, it's tax-free. You're getting a 50% discount anyway if you're over 12 months. And you're not doing any of these 5 things anyway if you're mining. Yep. So you're laughing. So as they say, if you want money, get fiat. If you want scarcity, get gold. If you want mega gains, get stocks. If you want all 3 at the same time, you get Bitcoin. And the final slide of my presentation always is, this is the view down from my residence on my estate. I live on the main island. My residence on my estate's a volcano. So the view down from my residence into the volcano is that. So
wow. Is that an active volcano?
No, dormant, thankfully, since 1926.
Wow, beautiful.
So my presentation always ends with an invitation for everyone to come and join us for geothermal mining on my island.
We might take you up on that, actually. So
you're welcome. I've got a standing invitation. It's well known throughout the Bitcoin community. That's why I have the Bitcoin Island domain, that all Bitcoiners are welcome at my island, gratis, free of charge. Pull up a little cabana or villa, hammock everywhere on the island.
That's what I call a citadel.
Yeah, 100%. That's fine.
Yeah. So how much longer are you in Auckland for?
They said, they reckon the physio was supposed to take about 6 to 8 months for the joint and about 8 to 10 months for the femur. But I've got avascular necrosis in the knees as well now, which has made rehabbing the joint and the leg a bit less than optimal. So fingers crossed by the end of the year.
So for those watching, you're not in a 5-star resort. You're actually in hospital.
I'm actually it's a rehab hospital, and it costs me a fair bit to be here. So it is not this 5-star resort that you're saying. That's wishful thinking. I'm actually in hospital. It's a very comfortable rehab hospital, but it is hospital. Yeah,
we absolutely appreciate your time for spending with us and our listeners.
No worries at all. Yeah, my pleasure, guys.
I have many questions, but I think we should probably finish up there. I'd like to get into climate change stuff, but that's probably for another time. Faris, have you got anything to end on?
I'll...
As far as I'm concerned, I blocked out this part of the day for you guys, so as many questions as you want.
Yeah. I think, look, from me personally, Laura Fusitu'a, is that both me and Gordon come originally from aid and development background. I worked for NGOs. I taught international relations. this is where we get really excited about Bitcoin, is seeing the real world case scenario. I will reach out to you. I do need to get going, but I will reach out to you via email, because whatever it is you are doing, and if there's any way I can help and be on a voluntary basis, I'd like to. I was in the aid and development sector, and I don't know, long story short, I think it ended up doing more harm than good. I was involved with the whole Millennium Development Goals and all that kind of stuff. And so World Bank, IMF programs, I know those, but this is where I get excited about Bitcoin. Awesome. So I will reach out to you. I'll send you my credentials. And if I could be of any use to you in your mission, please, I'd like to be.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Me too as well. Absolutely. Yeah. We've got a platform, so we have to use it as a podcast, but also 100%. As individuals.
I'll most definitely be reaching out.
Great.
Free help. You don't have to tell a Tongans like.
Absolutely. Well, how about we end on this question? This is kind of a stock standard question, but I think it's a good one. What can Bitcoin sort of fix and do, and what can't it do in Tonga?
I don't want to sound like an idealist, but it can pretty much, there's not too much it can't fix. I think, Bitcoin fixes everything that is under our control. Bitcoin can't fix the various insurgents of the various geopolitical powers, and the extent to which both, if you consider two sides, or all of them, if you consider them multifaceted, the extent to which that insurgents, I'm not sure if that's the right word, because that has a particular connotation, the insertion of those geopolitical powers into Tonga and our region. I'm speaking more regionally. And in the past week, the instance of all the ministers of finance of the Pacific being asked to pretty much sign an agreement on spec, a Chinese agreement that they were all given and had at about a day's notice, which is a great agreement, actually. But at a day's notice to sign. The Samoan Prime Minister, she was the matron of honour at my wedding. She's like a sister to me. She very eloquently stated that they weren't asked for their opinion. It wasn't sought. So these decisions should be made regionally rather than ad hoc. The metropole nations going to each nation individually about regional questions is something that should be phased out. And I think the Pacific Island Forum and what we've built there should be given the same credence as Europe expects us to give the EU, and for regional issues like that, with just that as an example, they should be more consulted on. So, basically, bottom line, the metropole nations should be more consultative, both bilaterally with each nation and most definitely multilaterally with the region as a whole. Particularly when it comes to trade and economic policy, the seasonal labourer regime that they've got, for instance, great for Tonga, great for Fiji or Vanuatu. We send labourers over because during COVID, the backpackers weren't allowed to travel from the Northern Hemisphere. So both the Australian and the New Zealand horticulture industry was about to get ruined because there was no one to pick those billions of dollars worth of fruit. So they reached out to the Pacific. They took all our unemployed. So when they take our unemployed, they should either have the same rights under New Zealand and Australia's labour laws, or the companies that take them over should have those protections explicitly in the contracts. So issues like that, which you guys will understand coming from the development background, which we don't have control over. Adam Smith International, who New Zealand pays to review their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, took me on as a consultant to review that regional, the seasonal worker program. And that was primarily, again, an example of the lack of consultation and protection across the board that the Pacific countries and our peoples are given, which is why a lot of us, I'm not sure how much you guys know or are into what PACER Plus is about. So PACER Plus is our NAFTA. It basically opens up all the Pacific markets to Australia and New Zealand. And it doesn't give us too much in return. So these kinds of things, Bitcoin cannot fix that. A lot of what will come of Bitcoin may be able to fix that. When Pacific nations become little Dubais, then even though we're still categorised by the UN as SIDS, Small Island Developing States, they have a section for us every September at the UN General Assembly in New York. All the SIDS have their own little functions. Hopefully we'll gradually make it back into the main forum where we discuss things with everyone else and not just sent off to the children's table.
When your GDP is 200 billion, I don't think you will be.
Yeah, that's right. I know, right? So hopefully those kinds of things will change over time.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, we really appreciate your time. We could go on and on, Paris. What a fascinating use case. As Faris said at the very beginning, sometimes Faris and I talk about the theory of Bitcoin, store of money, method of payment, whatever. But to see it in actual action and the potentials, and this is really what Bitcoin's about. It's not about someone in Manhattan, New York, just doing Forex trading on Binance or whatever. It's actually boots on the ground stuff. So it's amazing.
Yeah. When, I forget which interview it was, Jack Mallis was talking about being in El Salvador. He made friends with one of the young fisherman boys. And he was telling Jack, my father never had a bank account. My grandfather never had a bank account. I don't have a bank account. I've got a ledger and I've got Bitcoin. I can now participate in our financial system. That's what it's about.
Yeah, don't need a bank account. Yeah. Okay, very last question, I promise. When is the Tonga Bitcoin Beach happening?
Bitcoin Beach can honestly happen at any time. It's most likely, it's most sensible to have after legal tender has passed, because we don't have the infrastructure. Thinking off the top of my head, because Bitcoin Beach, I wouldn't necessarily want to be on my estate, obviously, not anywhere else. But my estate is not in a position infrastructurally to be able to pull off Bitcoin Beach right now. So it will most likely be on the main island, closer to one of the metropolitan areas, and straight after the legal tender, I'd start.
So I do have one last question. Because you said there was never any English colonization in Tonga, does that mean there are no queues in Tonga?
Sorry, there are no what?
Queues. Because you never had the English.
Well, the funny thing is, colonization is famously done with the gun or the Bible. So it wasn't done by the gun, but our king who modernized Tonga, who promulgated our constitution, one of the oldest in the world, actually, 1875, became a devout Christian. So we were Christianized by lower middle class English
Methodist, wasn't it?
Methodists. So we have a law in Tonga, still on the books, which is illegal for a man to be in public shirtless over the age of 16. Now, that's not Tongan culture because we never had any material, no cloth, cotton. We wore tapa cloths around our waists and were shirtless. So that law is a direct input of British lower middle class Methodist modesty. So everyone fully clothed, all the women dresses to the wrists and to the ankles, completely covered, and men the same, very modest, all in black Methodist ministerial suits, and the women in absolutely coverall long sleeve dresses. So, yeah, our culture was what is known as Tongan culture now is a hybrid of traditional Tongan culture and the very strong influence of specifically Methodist Christianity. So our over 1,400 year long tattooing tradition was outlawed in 1839. The missionaries drafted the piece of legislation which says all tattooing and other pagan festivals, blah, 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 because obviously we used to pray to our traditional gods, shall be outlawed. So for thousands of years, we've been getting tattooed. The word tattoo comes from the word tatau, which is the Tongan and Samoan and Hawaiian and Maori word for tattoo. So we took on, if you talk to a Tongan who's Tongan baby boomers about tattoos, they'll tell you tattoos are only for sailors and women of ill repute. So that's not a Tongan social mores. That's middle-class English Methodist social values that we've taken on, because tattooing is intrinsic to our culture. So as you can see, I was one of our later generation in the 90s and in the 2000s who reclaimed our tattooing tradition. So I'm covered neck to wrist to waist to knee in our traditional tattoos.
Wow.
Done the old way with the tap.
Yeah. I've seen that one. Yeah.
No
So,
Bitcoin tattoos?
You do have one, don't you?
That's a great question. Yeah. Funnily, I was asked that before, actually.
Yeah.
So the clan that I belong to, all the lords, similar to the Scottish Highlands and whatever, are grouped into clans. So the clan I belong to is like the Round Table. We're the royal guard that protects this current dynasty. So this current dynasty is the same line for 1,200 years, but the current dynasty, it's like movement from the House of Windsor to the House of Windsor is an extension of the previous houses. So this dynasty, 1600s, we're the royal guard. So one of our duties was to oversee sound money. So to make sure that there's not an inflationary supply of the goods that were traded. So we have a motif for sound money in Tonga. So if sound money, there is only one sound money, and that's Bitcoin. So if that motif means sound money, then it obviously must mean Bitcoin.
Fantastic. That's really good.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's my interpretation, and I'm going to stick with it. So.
Yeah, you don't need one. You don't need a Bitcoin tattoo. You already got one.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an absolute pleasure, Lord. And
my pleasure, guys.
We'd love to have you. We'd love to have you on again in 6 months down the line, see what's happening. But I will reach out to you tomorrow because, if you can use me or Gordon anyway, we would love to.
Absolutely,
we'd love to collaborate.
We're close by. We're in the region too, so
yeah, I'm sure they're 100% down the line. I will need to reach out for one reason or another. And like I said, man, you don't have to ask us twice. I'll definitely reach out whenever I'm in Melbourne or down in Nelson and need a feed. I'll know who to call.
Absolutely.
You're welcome here anytime. So do you leave the hospital, or are you stuck in the hospital full time?
No, I'm stuck in the hospital.
Man.
It's a rehab hospital, but it's two wings. So one is the rehab hospital, the other is like a hospice for elderly people. So because elderly people are the highest risk of COVID, our whole facility is covered as COVID delicate. So I haven't. My mother is about 3 streets away, but I haven't seen her since July because we're not allowed in.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's tough.
Yeah.
Wow.
You got to do what you can.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to give you my
soon.
Contact details. So, I work alone, and this is what we're doing full time in Gordon. So, if you ever need to choose,
I'll be in touch with you guys. I'm not sure how much you guys get involved with the community's Twitter spaces or.
Oh, we are involved. I just had a meetup here in Nelson. I'm going to be in Auckland in a few weeks' time. Actually, I'm looking to host a meetup up there. Nice. This is what we're doing.
Zoom me in from the meetup so we can have a chat.
Absolutely.
Right.
Okay, that's a good idea.
Yeah. So I'll
be in touch tomorrow.
Yeah.
Go on.
I'll give
What's
you guys
your
the link.
handle?
I'm just Lord Fusitu'a on everything.
Yeah, I'll click on Twitter.
Yeah. Okay.
So
I'll
Twitter
reach out.
spaces daily with some of the thought leaders in the community. Shinobi, Sailor comes in, McCormack comes in, Nick Carter, everyone comes in. So
we've had those guys on the show, so it's awesome. Such a good community.
Exactly.
But
so
now we're keen to actually catch up with Samson now, so we might, we'll,
tell him to send me some more units.
Yeah.
Okay. But I'll be in touch soon. So I've got another Zoom call coming up, but thank you very much for your time.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Paris. Thank you, Gordon. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for watching or listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, subscribe, and share so we can spread this educational content to others like yourself. Visit bitcoinbasics.help.
Disclaimer. Any content provided by CoinCompass is for educational and informational purposes only and is not investment, legal, tax, or any other professional advice. A qualified professional should be consulted before making any financial decisions. CoinCompass will at times recommend certain products, services, and technologies, but these are opinions based upon our own or podcast guests' experience and not endorsements. We take no liability for out-of-date or inaccurate information, software bugs, manufacturing errors, technology misuse, or issues involving third parties. Visit coincompass.com for more information and please contact us.